Hey everyone, this is Ben Norton and this is Moderate Rebels. I'm joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal and we are speaking with Brian Berletic. Today we're going to talk about the situation in Southeast Asia and specifically in Myanmar. If you've been following Western media reporting in the past few weeks, in February there was a military coup in Myanmar and there's been constant reporting and there's been reporting that is very similar to the kind of reporting that we talk about at the Gray Zone. If you remember back to the war in Libya in 2011, the beginning of the war in Syria, where the media talks about these great peace-loving democratic protesters. And we're here to complicate that narrative and understand what's actually going on in Myanmar. And we're joined by one of the very few geopolitical analysts and independent journalists who's been covering Myanmar in a critical alternative way. His name is Brian Berletic, and he runs the blog Land Destroyer. He also has a YouTube channel under the same name, Land Destroyer, and he's been publishing a lot of really interesting videos. I would highly recommend checking them out, looking at the role of the U.S. government, the National Endowment for Democracy, in funding a lot of these opposition groups. So, Brian, can you just give us an overview? Who are you and what inspires you to do this kind of journalism? Because it's not something that we see really anywhere else, especially in mainstream media.
Okay, so I was a U.S. Marine at the age of 17, and I saw firsthand kind of what I was never in combat. I was stationed overseas in Japan, but I even just doing that, I could see what the U.S. was doing around the world. You sign up because you want to defend your country, you buy into all the patriotism, and then you actually see how it actually works and how the US, even with their supposed allies, the way they treat them. I was disillusioned when I got out of the military. This was right around the time the US was getting ready to invade Iraq. And I was opposed to that. And even people in the military could kind of see that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. This was a thing that was just going to happen, and everyone had to go along with it. I was totally against the war, and I was so against the war that I decided I wasn't even going to live in the US. I was going to go to Thailand. This was a country that I had visited while in the military as part of our training. And I really loved the country, the culture, everything about it. And I thought, if I have to go somewhere, why not try Thailand? And I've been there ever since. I've been there for about 17 years. And I was already following politics, especially about the war in Iraq and then also Afghanistan. And then I started kind of branching out, trying to figure out, what can I do about this? And how come every time I turn on the news, everything that I hear is not true? We're obviously being lied to. And it was out of frustration that I started writing. And in Thailand, I started to see, I thought, I'm in Thailand, I'm on the other side of the planet, I'm as far away physically as you can be from the US, and yet I could still see the US reaching in and interfering, even here in Thailand. And around 2009 and 2010, there were back-to-back protests by a group, these red shirts, and we hear about color revolutions. They were literally all wearing red shirts, and they were out in the streets rioting. In 2009, they were rioting, arson. Nobody died then. Well, two people died. They were shopkeepers trying to protect their shops, and the rioters killed them. But then the following year, it got real serious. The opposition, backed by the US, introduced armed militants. And what they did was kill people on both sides, the police and the military, but also their own protesters. And I was watching this, and I was watching the Western media. They saw the war weapons, they saw the violence in the streets, and then they would go write their articles, and they would say the Thai military is killing peaceful, unarmed protesters. And even to this day, if you read about this in the Western media, this is how they're going to spin it. They're not going to mention this group of armed militants, or if they do, they'll mention them in passing, bury them somewhere deep in the article. And this is what got me writing. And then the next year was the Arab Spring. As soon as that started, I knew that was the exact same thing. I dug in. I followed the money through the Endowment for Democracy, US Aid, Google, Facebook. Even back then, they were already getting heavily involved in US State Department projects. And I saw that. I remember John McCain saying that it was a virus that was going to get Russia and China. I think everyone remembers John McCain making that comment. And I knew that it was going to come around to Asia, that this sort of coordinated region-wide chaos was going to target Asia. And I just decided that from that point on, I was just going to try to expose what was going on within the Arab Spring, the war with Libya, the war with Syria, as much as possible. So if people understood the mechanics of this, when it started in Asia, it would be so much easier for me to explain to people what was happening, so that when it happened, whatever media was interested in covering it, they would have this starting point. So for 10 years, I've been just putting out as many articles as possible, and now videos. And I was doing this under the name Tony Cartalucci. It was a pen name. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want anyone to know who I was. It was also kind of a form of protection. But then Twitter and Facebook deleted me off their platforms, and they deleted my personal accounts also on the same day. And so that meant they knew who I was. And then the US Embassy here in Bangkok, because I was exposing US-backed regime change here, made several statements talking about an English language blog. They wouldn't name it, but it was my blog. So I felt if I came out and people knew who I was, that would be a better form of protection than being anonymous. I was pretty sure they knew who I was. So that's why I got involved in this. And Myanmar, actually, I've been writing about that since 2011, because I could see that the US was doing the same thing there that they were doing here in Thailand. And not to get too ahead, but if we remember the Pentagon Papers back in the 60s and 70s, they were talking about a long-standing policy of containing China, and Southeast Asia was one of the fronts specifically mentioned that they were going to work on in order to contain China. So that's all this is. It's one continuous foreign policy, despite whoever's in Congress or the White House. This has gone on continuously from then until now. And that's what we're seeing in Myanmar. This is all about containing China. And then there's protests here in Thailand. And then we remember the violent riots in Hong Kong. They're all connected. And the protesters themselves and the organizers and the leaders getting US support, they all openly coordinate together. And they call themselves the Milk Tea Alliance.
Right.
People might start hearing that.
Which now has an official Twitter icon logo or whatever. Like if you do hashtag Milk Tea Alliance, which is like the biggest sign of a PSYOP campaign, every single astroturfed so-called movement gets that. I mean, it's like a corporate logo. You might as well just have like a TM sign next to it.
And it really,
exactly.
I mean, Twitter lumped it in with Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, such as it is. So I don't know if it's saying that those two are completely co-opted, or that it's trying to kind of nestle it in when it really represents a U.S. arc of instability in the Pacific Rim. So I guess we should talk about your article and your videos on Myanmar, Libya, and Syria, the dangerous parallels there. But I think we need some background here for viewers and listeners, just on what happened in February and the background to that. I mean, there's been this long-standing movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League of Democracy, to supposedly bring democracy to Myanmar. She served as leader. She was democratically elected and wound up being sort of discredited by her patrons, the Bonos of the world, the Ken Roths, the Madeleine Albrights, the National Endowment for Democracy, which gave her an award, and they, named her the lady, and she was this global hero. I mean, she came to sort of prominence starting in 1988, which was the beginning of, it was really Gene Sharp's testing ground, was Burma 1988. And she was discredited by her own patrons because she signed off on the military's campaign against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. And now these same patrons are calling for her to come back and restore democracy. Her people are in the street. So I guess before we get into Myanmar, Libya, and Syria, and this kind of arc of instability, the Arab Spring coming to Southeast Asia, what happened in February? What drove the military coup to take Aung San Suu Kyi out of power? And what had been happening leading up to that point?
Aung San Suu Kyi, just like you said, has been a project of the U.S. State Department and also the British government for decades. And they have poured so much into building up her network. And that network, if you talk to any of these people, these so-called pro-democracy opposition figures in Myanmar, these people are beyond, you can't have a conversation with them. They are so brainwashed. And one thing that you will notice is that they are inveterate racists. These were actually the people brutalizing the Rohingya for years and years and years. And the Western media covered it up because just like in Syria and Libya, the opposition are actually people and groups that you cannot present to the public. You need to constantly paper over what they actually stand for, what they believe in, what they say on a day-to-day basis. This idea of Aung San Suu Kyi, the lady, this saint of democracy, and her followers flocking and guiding Myanmar into democracy, this was always a fiction. It never existed. If you talk to these people, since I've been writing about Myanmar since 2011, and when I used to be on U.S. social media, these people would attack me. They would say things like, the Rohingya, there's no such thing as Rohingya. These are Bengali invaders, and they're stealing our food and our water. It's the worst.
And just for context, the Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic group in Western Myanmar who have been subjected to what the UN calls ethnic cleansing at the hands of the military. But you're saying that Aung San Suu Kyi's crowd, which is now the official supposedly pro-democratic opposition, was directly involved with their hands in that campaign of ethnic hatred against the Rohingya.
Yes, and if you actually read the Western media's own accounts of a lot of these incidents, you'll actually notice that they will admit that the military had to show up and break up the violence, the police and the military. There's also stories where the military-led government, before Aung San Suu Kyi came into power, they tried to grant the Rohingya some sort of intermediate status on their way towards citizenship so that they would be able to vote in elections. It was Aung San Suu Kyi's followers who blocked that. So
why do they hate them so much?
Okay, well, we could go all the way back to before Myanmar, when Myanmar was Burma. It was a British colony, and the British spent over 100 years fomenting this ethnic animosity in between these groups. The colonial army included these ethnic minorities. The Burman ethnic majority was excluded from administrating the colony and from being in the military. So they basically subjugated the majority with the minority, and this has created this vicious animosity that still stands today. These ethnic armed groups, these rebels that we always hear about. That was the remnants of the British colonial army, and the British didn't just leave when they lost the colony. They kept pouring money into those ethnic groups, and then the U.S. poured money and weapons into those ethnic groups, up to and including to today. So this is why they all hate each other, because it's British and colonial divide and conquer, and this is something that they have continuously invested in. So for the Rohingya, for example, the West has tried to infiltrate that group with their fake human rights groups. There's a lot of genuine groups trying to stand up for them, but the U.S. has sent these NED and Open Society funded groups in there to politically leverage the crisis. But they also are backing the viciously racist supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi. So they're fueling both sides. And then when the Rohingya, there was this very tiny armed militant group that sprung up. The guy who was leading that was actually born in Pakistan. He was in Saudi Arabia, and then they sent him over.
Like the Salvation Front or something like that, right?
Something, I think it's the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, something like that. And again, it's exactly what they did in Libya and Syria. They have these extremists. The U.S. doesn't want to sponsor them directly, so they launder the job through the Saudis or Turkey or something like that. And so they were fueling both sides of that conflict. If you look at Rakhine State, where the Rohingya are, and again, I want to point out, these people have been there for generations. I'm sure there's probably people that were brought in by the British. There's probably also people that cross over the border, but there have been Rohingya in that area for generations. They're stirring this trouble up because China was trying to build a port there. And they have a pipeline that goes from that port all the way through Myanmar and toward Kunming, China. This was so that China doesn't have to make that trip through the strait, so that they could cut the time of transit for hydrocarbons. So this was all about disrupting that. And then all along the pipeline, all these armed ethnic groups are being funded and armed to complicate Chinese infrastructure projects and development inside Myanmar. So the
I just want
Rohingya
to
thing.
point out really quickly that what you're saying has been even confirmed, ironically, by the International Crisis Group, which is basically a Western intelligence cutout, which is funded by Western governments and is often, it publishes these white papers, these policy papers, and even they have acknowledged that they've linked the insurgent groups to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is the same kind of, those were the countries involved in helping the CIA in Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan. So, I mean, there are a lot of similarities here, of course.
Exactly. So it wasn't about the Rohingya. It's not about these ethnic groups, each and every one of their individual backstories. It's about finding anyone that they can try to find some sort of ethno-religious fault line, exploit it to balkanize the country, to wreck it, because Myanmar has no real trade with the West. I mean, if you look at their exports and imports, it's single digits. The bulk of their trade is with China and Thailand.
Right. They've been sanctioned
in Singapore, right?
Yes, Singapore. Yes,
that's they've been sanctioned for some 20 years by the West, but it's very hard to hear the military junta, the Tatmadaw side of the story, but I managed to find a clip from 2000, I believe, of one of the generals declaring that they can't allow Aung San Suu Kyi into power because it would turn the country into Bosnia. The country would be completely balkanized. And that's why they have invalidated election results in the past. Is that why the military staged this coup in February of this year? And what has happened since? Because I think what we're seeing in the streets now, with the opposition officially calling for R2P, a humanitarian military intervention, a regime change war by the U.S., is a major escalation that completely validates everything you've been saying.
Well, Max, really quickly, we should give brief context on what R2P is. That's the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was used to invoke Western military intervention in Yugoslavia, which balkanized Yugoslavia, and then used to justify military intervention in Libya in 2011. And as Max said, I mean, I'll get up photos in a second while Brian speaks, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these protesters that are holding signs saying, implement R2P. And on Twitter, there's been these massive social media campaigns, implement the responsibility to protect, which is the clearest possible sign the clearest call you can possibly make for Western foreign intervention in your country.
Exactly. So
on the February coup.
Yeah. So the reason they did that was because even though Aung San Suu Kyi was being attacked by the West, seemingly, I don't think that was the West trying to oust her from power. I think that was just them putting pressure on her to cut ties with China, even though there's no alternative. There's no alternative for Myanmar to turn to if they did that. And so I think they were putting that pressure on them. One, because I think they still wanted a pretext to get involved. I always suspected that whole Rohingya crisis they were fueling from both sides. They wanted to turn that into a humanitarian crisis where they might. It's their dream to put Western troops somewhere else on China's border other than Afghanistan. This is their dream. And Myanmar is the only vulnerable country in the region that I think they think they can do that in. So I always figured that was the reason they were fueling that Rohingya crisis, but also they might have wanted to put pressure on Aung San Suu Kyi to obediently cut ties, and just like Australia is doing, cut the throat of their economy just to spite China and to please Washington. So I think that was the reasoning behind it. Myanmar's military was under no illusions that somehow Aung San Suu Kyi was going to turn around and work with them and build a future together. Her entire network for decades has been built up and is entirely dependent on the West. All of that money coming in. If you go to the NED's website right now for Myanmar, which are still calling Burma the British colonial nomenclature, you will see, I think, is about 80 programs, and that's programs, not the individual organizations or people. That's just the programs. It's a lot. It's a lot more than here in Thailand, and the NED funding here in Thailand is very disruptive. So we can only imagine just how deeply they've penetrated Myanmar's society. Every aspect of socio-political day-to-day life has been infected by these NED-funded organizations. If you look in their media, because the government's media, international media, doesn't exist. They've got the Irrawaddy, Myanmar, Myanmar Now. These are newspapers you will see the Western media constantly citing. They're all funded by the NED. And they have this Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. I think we remember the fake human rights fronts in Libya and Syria, tallying up the deaths day to day. This is what they're doing, AAPP. This is what they're doing in Myanmar. And you will see the Western media cite them almost on a daily basis. The guy who founded it.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian. I just want to point out, keep going.
Okay, we'll just get this one out. The guy who founded it and runs it, Ko Bo Chi, he has his own web page on the NED's website because he's an NED fellow. And of course, AAPP is funded by the NED. So that's who's giving you these death tallies on a day-to-day basis, a U.S. government funded front.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to point out the same thing and how similar that is to what happened in Syria. Because what happens is, I was looking through these media reports on Myanmar, and they're claiming that hundreds of protesters have been massacred by the military. And we can talk about the violence, because as you've said in you showed in your reporting that it's also two-sided violence. It's not just one-sided. It's like in Syria and Libya, it's not just the peaceful protesters who are being slaughtered. I mean, they're attacking the state forces as well. But anyway, the point is that if you look at pretty much any Western media report, the Associated Press, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, they all cite this group, the AAPP, funded by the NED, for the figures. And they always refer to it as an independent monitoring group, which is exactly the same model for Syria. There was a group called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which was like the AAPP. It wasn't actually based in the country. It was run by exiles. In the case of the Syrian Observatory, it was based in Coventry, England, in a small town in England, run by one guy, this guy, Rami Abdul Rahman, who was running it out of his house. And he later expanded, and he got more money, including he got funding from the British government. But still today, pretty much all of the statistics on deaths in Syria come from this one group, which again is run by an opposition guy. I mean, there's also the Syrian Network for Human Rights.
Well, he started reporting too accurately, because he was reporting that the conflict was militarized and that over 100,000 people had died on the loyalist government side, and that 70,000 Syrian soldiers of the Syrian Arab Army had died. So now they created or turned to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which is a front by the Syrian opposition run out of their fake parallel government in Qatar. And we can see in Myanmar, there's a move to establish the CRPH, another a parallel government.
Exactly. So we see the parallel government already created. They claim that it's based in one of these remote areas protected by these armed ethnic groups, which like I said, their inception was Anglo-American backing when it was a British colony. And then also during World War II, the US and British gave them arms, and they were fighting side by side against the Japanese. And then once the war was over, they tried to use these armed ethnic groups to reassert control over Myanmar, and then they failed because independence was established. but they never gave up trying to use these groups to destabilize and destroy Myanmar. And these groups, they have already openly said that they are going to intervene militarily because of the protests. And let's talk about the protests. They were violent from the very beginning. These, like I said, these were groups of people who used to go into Rohingya communities with machetes and chop people up into pieces, burn their homes down, burn their businesses down. They did not go from that level of violence to being peaceful pro-democracy protesters when the military took over in February. It just isn't so. Because they've deleted Myanmar's military off of US-based social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, you're only going to see one side of the story, their side. And of course, just like I said, these are all media organizations funded by the US government. So just like in Libya and Syria, they said that they were peaceful protesters up to when the Libyan or Syrian government were using air power. And then they couldn't cover it up anymore because they were using air power because the peaceful protesters had tanks and RPGs and machine guns. And these armed groups, what you just saw in the picture there, that was a recent picture that they posted on Twitter. They stormed a military outpost, and the people, maybe you can't see in that picture, but the people at their feet, sitting on the ground, those are captured Myanmar soldiers. And then there's a pile of weapons that they took. So this is what's going on right now inside Myanmar. They are having there's armed conflict there. It's not just the military running around killing innocent protesters. They're saying something like 700-800 people have died. If Myanmar's military wanted to go out and kill unarmed protesters, they could do that in a day. And they don't have to wait. They don't have to draw it out like this. This is because there's violence on both sides, and they need to use lethal force because they're being attacked.
Brian, really quickly, I just want you to, I mean, you already kind of clarified it, but just for our viewers and listeners, one of the narratives that we keep hearing from people, if you point out everything that you're saying here, that it's a more complicated narrative, that the U.S. and other Western powers have been funding the opposition, that they've been burning down Chinese businesses, which we'll talk about in a second, targeting Chinese-owned infrastructure. Aside from all of that, what people will say is that, well, you are supporting the military, the Myanmar military that is committing genocide against the Rohingya. But what you're saying is actually, it's the opposite, that these ethnic militias that have been attacking the military are the same kind of ethnic sectarian militias that have also been for years attacking the Rohingya.
Well, okay, actually, the armed ethnic groups, they're in remote areas. They're not near the Rohingya. This would be the Burman ethnic majority that were attacking them. These would be the so-called pro-democracy activists, the followers of Aung San Suu Kyi. These are the people who were attacking the Rohingya. And I'm not going to say that supporters of the military don't have some sort of ethnic animosity as well. I'm sure that they do. I'm just telling you, you could read Western media reports. Buried in their reports, you can see them admitting that it was the military trying to give the Rohingya, a stepping stone towards citizenship. And it was Aung San Suu Kyi's nationalist, ultra-nationalist followers that blocked that prevented that from happening. And like I said, I will do a video like this and they'll say, none of that's true. Anyway, the Rohingya are there's no such thing as Rohingya. And then they will go off on this ultra-racist rant. And, they speak for themselves. That's the Joe, go talk to them. They're not afraid to tell you how they feel about the Rohingya. They will tell you themselves that they're not an ethnic group in Myanmar. They're Bengali invaders and they need to be exported from the country, even though they've been there for generations.
And right. And so back to the issue of ethnic militias, there's talk of forming a sort of a parallel, not only a parallel government, but a federal army, a parallel army. And we've seen in Myanmar Now and other publications you've pointed to, Myanmar Now being publication funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. We've also found documents in the anonymous leaks from the British Foreign Office showing that the Foreign Office is sponsoring it as well. But they talk about how the so-called the protesters are militarizing and they're going out to the countryside to join the ethnic militias because that's the only way they can protect themselves, which is a very similar narrative to what we heard about in 2011, 2012 in Syria, that the protesters, in order to protect themselves, got weapons. But you pointed to this initially as evidence that what the West calls peaceful protesters are actually already militarized. Is that correct? Are we seeing actual combat already?
There's already armed clashes, and the Western media claims that Myanmar's military is already using air power in certain instances. The protesters themselves, if you watch enough of the footage, even from the Western media, you're going to see them running around with machetes and Molotov cocktails. If you had someone with a machete running at you or trying to light you on fire, I think it's fair to say that the only thing you had was a rifle. You'd probably shoot them. I think that's a lot of the initial violence, and these armed groups have openly stated that they are going to intervene, and there is fighting already. So, we already have people crossing the border into Thailand, allegedly fleeing this violence. So this is what's happening, and again, exactly like Libya and Syria. And I just heard the U.S. representative to the UN, Linda Thomas
Greenfield, yeah.
And she already said that they're doing the sanctions and everything else, but the Security Council needs to act. So what does that mean when they say that? And they're not going to let Myanmar's military destabilize the region. They're going to stop that, which is said with no irony and no sense of shame, considering this entire crisis was deliberately engineered by the US by supporting this opposition, artificially maintaining these ethnic animosities between all of these groups. And now that there's this conflagration, they want to intervene. This is exactly what they did in the Middle East. They planned it meticulously for years. They executed it. And then they said, oh, we need to intervene to stop this. And then, of course, once they intervene, it gets even worse.
I just want to point out that what you were saying, Brian, has been confirmed even by Myanmar Now, which is this Western government-funded media outlet. They just published this article and video titled "Abolish the Fascist Army," and a defector says that unarmed resistance is not enough. So they're explicitly, openly calling for armed resistance. Like
exactly.
It can't get more blatant.
This is what they do. They try to cover up the violence for as long as possible. And then when it's no longer possible because there's going to be footage of machine guns and rocket launchers, they have no way of explaining how that just suddenly happened. So this is how they tiptoe into just revealing that they've been armed. And it's the exact same thing here. The protesters in the streets here in Thailand, they don't have weapons like guns, not yet, but they have been extremely violent. And the Western media never mentions it. They never mention that they initiate the violence each and every time. They are destroying property every time they go out. They are attacking the police first. They completely flip the narrative around. And this is exactly what they've been doing in Myanmar from day one. And we've seen this over and over again, no matter where it is.
Right. I mean, and there was this clip that really reminded me of Syria as well that I found on Twitter from the Twitter account of an American guy with a man bun who is in Myanmar right now. And he didn't say it in his bio, but this hipster guy with his sunglasses and his man bun and his V-neck is a staffer for the Solidarity Center, which is basically a longtime CIA front that is run through the AFL-CIO, and it's a vehicle for the U.S. to penetrate labor unions abroad, prevent them from mobilizing in a socialist direction, and has even been used recently in Venezuela to destabilize that country. And here he is, this U.S. government-sponsored labor organizer in Myanmar, calling explicitly for a U.S. military intervention, for arming the so-called moderate rebels. I mean, basically for the country to be flooded and turned into a bloody civil war. And then he takes off his glasses and has this moment of fake crying where he says, these people are being slaughtered. And
why not now? If the U.S. says they stand with democracy, this is the most black and white, clear-cut case I've ever seen of democracy versus tyranny and, freedom versus dictatorship. The U.S. should intervene in any way they can physically with the military, give arms to the people, do whatever they have to do to stand with the people and stop what's happening by the military.
That's what we need also too. So can you say the last one to the Myanmar people? Can you say anything from Myanmar people?
To the Myanmar people, I know they've been standing really strong. And they've been fighting really hard. Just stay strong. Keep fighting. Stay strong. They'll win. If they stay strong.
Thank you very much for your cooperation. Thank you very much.
What if you're going to really cry, then you would leave your glasses on and it would just come out authentically. But he took them off because it was like, here's my moment to shine. It's like all the CNN anchors would do in 2016 in Syria. It was like they could all go viral if they had a fake cry for some Syrian child whose family later turned out to support the government, like the dusty boy Omran. But anyway,
or if they smelled backpacks that were supposedly full of chemical weapons, because that's safe to do.
And there's definitely something that stings.
Well, that hasn't happened yet, but it reminded me so much of all the Vice hipsters who went to the Turkish border and then stuck one foot in, occupied FSA occupied Syria, which was really where the Turkish rat lines were going, like the Danny Golds, all the tattooed neocons who had just flocked in, and then they would meet some rebels and become really moved by the experience they heard, and then they would do this performative tirade calling for a no-fly zone. Like Danny Gold's Twitter account in 2013, every other tweet was no fly zone now, intervene now, you must intervene, no fly zone. So I just see these patterns, and it's shocking that an American guy thinks he can go in with the US government backing him and call for a sovereign country that is not his to be flooded with weapons. It was just staggering. You've been in Thailand. Are you seeing anything that we're not seeing in the media here with U.S. penetration? You're presenting this, Brian, really as a wholly U.S. project to destabilize Myanmar and create an arc of instability across Southeast Asia. Are you seeing anything on the ground there like this?
Absolutely. I'm in Thailand. They're doing the exact same thing here. They're just not as successful. The entire opposition here in Thailand, this billionaire named Thanathorn, he's presented as this young next generation leader of Thailand. He's going to, bring Thailand into the future. Before the 2019 general election, he actually traveled to the United States. He hired a lobbyist to help arrange meetings with people in the U.S. government, in Congress, in the U.S. State Department, but also with U.S. aid. He and his family, they're billionaires. Why are they going to U.S. aid? They just hand out money. So why is he meeting with them? And then he met with Freedom House, which we all know is just a subsidiary or a tentacle extending out of the National Endowment for Democracy. And then when he came back, he lost the general election by over 2 million votes. And then his party was dissolved because he donated money to his party, and then he said it was a loan that they were somehow going to pay back, which is illegal under Thai law. So the party was dissolved, so he was leading the protests himself, and then he kind of hid behind them, and they wanted to make it look like an organic, student-led, self-organized protest. But all of the leaders were from NED-funded NGOs, fake NGOs. There was a petition to rewrite Thailand's entire constitution, pushed by an organization called ILAW, which from its inception was funded by the US government and Open Society. And so they're doing the exact same thing here. The protesters here openly back the protesters in Myanmar and are demanding that ASEAN, it's kind of like a very light version of the European Union. They don't, there's none of this interconnectivity. It's kind of a loose alliance of Southeast Asia. And they have a very strict non-intervention, non-interference principle. But the US-backed opposition here is demanding that Thailand intervene. And they were also traveling to Hong Kong to meet with Joshua Wong and Nathan Law, and they wanted to invite them here to Thailand, and the Thai government turned them away at the airport. So this is a region-wide project. And the common denominator is they all hate China and they're all funded by the US government. That's the only common denominator among all of them. And a lot of them went to the Oslo Freedom Forum. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but the BBC themselves even admitted that the Hong Kong protest leaders were trained at the Oslo Freedom Forum and then sent back to do their riots.
We know
we're very familiar with them, and I'll cut to Max in a second. But I just want to point out, because you just mentioned Hong Kong, that if you go back and look at the Twitter public policy tweet announcing the Milk Tea Alliance official corporate branded symbol, like the logo, and if you look at the countries, they have 4 flags specifically here. So they have Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, and Myanmar. So like those are the 4 countries that Twitter itself is pointing out are like the opposition forces, well, at least in Hong Kong and Myanmar and Thailand are working together, and then of course with Taiwan, which is of course basically a U.S. military base.
Exactly, and you'll see the opposition figures here go to Taiwan. I think it's like the Taiwan Endowment for Democracy. All I know is it's an NED subsidiary that they set up in Taiwan. Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, something like that. And it's supposed to be like their regional nexus. And so there have been opposition figures and these fake academics traveling to Taiwan to that foundation, and they come here, and it's just this huge network. And the reason why they're doing this is because none of the actual governments in this region want to create a problem with China. There's this enduring Cold War myth that Thailand is some sort of close ally of the US. Right now, Thailand's biggest trade partner is China. Biggest investor is China. Largest source of tourism comes from China. More tourists come from China than all Western countries combined to Thailand. All of their weapons are being bought mainly from China. They just replaced all their really old US main battle tanks with Chinese VT-4s, and they're building a high-speed railway with China that will connect Kunming, run through Laos, and all through Thailand. So this is something all of these governments in the region want and are benefiting from. Clearly, I live here. I've watched the transformation myself. They will never convince these governments to cut ties with China. So they are organizing these opposition groups that will destabilize and overthrow these governments and replace them with a client regime that will, an obedient client regime that will. That's what this whole project is about. The Arab Spring was to encircle and contain Iran and then work their way toward Russia and China. And it's just all part of the same project.
And you've pointed out that there's this information war that goes with it. They've established a media apparatus inside Myanmar. I suppose you're seeing it in Thailand as well. But we've seen Twitter and the social media giants kick off any government-related media entity, so that, I mean, as half-assed as it is, as poorly put together, it's kind of like a military junta version of Weird Al's UHF. The Myanmar government is unable to tell its side of the story.
Exactly. And the only way I see this turning around as far as the information war is if China or Russia lent their media expertise the way they did kind of for Syria, because I don't think Syria had a very strong information game, not in the beginning. And that's the only way they'll turn that around. Otherwise, they're going to have to depend entirely on their game on the ground, trying to stabilize the country and deal with these groups, which I don't know how well that's going to work. Like I said, the NED and all of these organizations have infected Myanmar society so deeply. Even I think is the worst case in the entire region. It's very unfortunate.
And you've talked about the NED a lot, which is the U.S. government's regime change arm, but you also published a video which makes you officially anti-Semitic because you dared to talk about this international billionaire hedge funder and vulture capitalist who happens to sponsor opposition organizations and media in countries around the world, but you're not allowed to talk about him because he's George Soros. But what is George Soros's role here, or the role of the Open Society institutes that he bankrolls?
The way I see open society is that they just kind of work in parallel. I've never seen them involved in something that the NED wasn't involved in. Sometimes, and I suspect this is why they use foundations like Open Society, is they I think they know there's growing awareness of the NED and how it is the U.S. government just laundering money to these opposition groups.
And they can do things the U.S. government can't do technically, or is technically forbidden from doing.
Exactly. So it's just a loophole. It's a way to exploit loopholes. One of the articles that the Gray Zone wrote that I've been sharing with absolutely everybody is the one with the BBC and Reuters signing the confidential contracts with the British government to basically do information or influence operations inside other countries. And I've tried to expose this here in Thailand. The BBC, Reuters, and all of these Western media organizations have their foreign correspondence club here in Thailand. It's called the FCCT, and it's in a downtown skyscraper, and it's this like penthouse. And what they were doing was they were taking. It was the Soros leaks revealed that they were taking money from Open Society, and I revealed this, I exposed this, and they denied it. And then as I was digging, I actually found the official website of the front that they were using. It was called the Indochina Memorial Media Foundation, something like that. And if you looked at About Us, the president was also the president of the Foreign Correspondence Club of Thailand, and the address was literally inside the FCCT. It was the FCCT. It was just a front that they were using. And what were they doing with that? They were taking that money and they were training cadres of propagandists, local people, to just spread out across the region, and it was building up capacity to spread Western propaganda in Southeast Asia. And actually, the Minister of Information in Myanmar, before the military took over, was trained through this program. So this is just something they do everywhere. And Open Society was funding that, maybe because they didn't want it to be directly connected to the US or British government.
Yeah,
Right.
I wanna point out really quickly, just to get some context. I think a lot of our readers and listeners might know this, but it's important to stress that when we look at the role of George Soros, I mean, of course, there are these right-wingers who do actually have anti-Semitic obsessions with him, which often distracts from the role of other agencies like the CIA and other billionaires. But I think at the same time, progressives absolutely need to understand the role he plays. And I think there's one article that at the Gray Zone we point to a lot, which is, I have up on the screen for people watching, from the Washington Post. It's called "Innocence Abroad, the New World of Spyless Coups," which is by David Ignatius, who is basically a CIA stenographer. He's very close to the CIA, and he always pushes their line in the Washington Post. And he talks about how, so this was written in 1991 with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and then following with the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. And he talks about this network of overt operatives who were developed, that were funded by the NED, funded by these foundations like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. And he says they have been doing in public what the CIA used to do in private. And then he quotes one of the co-founders of the NED, who said that what we are doing today is what the CIA used to do in private. But what's important about this article also is that he specifically names Soros among other people. He quotes Alan Weinstein, who's one of the co-founders of the National Endowment for Democracy, who says, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA." But he also names, people on Twitter and in media articles, independent media, they'll quote that line a lot. But then there's also another paragraph that follows that talks about some of the people who played a supplementary role in these coups and color revolutions in Eastern Europe. He names William Miller of the American Committee on U.S.-Soviet Relations, financier George Soros of the Soros Foundation. He also names other groups, the Atlantic Council, the Institute for Soviet-American Relations. He says this truly has been a revolution by committee. He also says the AFL-CIO deserves a healthy pat on the back. And of course, Max just mentioned that the AFL-CIO, through its international center, is funded by
Solidarity Center.
Yeah, and they also funded the Polish trade union Solidarity. And there's another thing I want to point out, that when we know, because of reporting, especially this brilliant book, The Cultural Cold War, which details in one of the chapters how the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation have served as CIA cutouts, and they have these extensive links to Western intelligence. And I think Open Society is very clearly playing the exact same role that the Ford Foundation played. And if you look at the founding statement of Open Society, when it was founded by Soros in the 1980s, who was at the cutting edge of these neoliberals who were trying to privatize the economies, the then socialist economies of Eastern Europe, what he always said, although this has later been removed from the OSF website, but it always has said, this is the European Foundation Center. Open Society Institute was created in 1993 by investor George Soros to support his foundations in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. These were the ones that were created in the 1980s when they were beginning to have perestroika and the privatization policies. And this says explicitly, those foundations were established starting in 1984 to help countries make the transition from communism. It used to say that all over the OSF website, but they have later rebranded. But that was the explicit goal from day one of the Open Society Institute and Foundations, was always to make society's so-called transition. That was the explicit stated goal from day one. It was never about progressive policies or humanity. It was about transition, i.e. regime change. So, I mean, all these liberals are like, well, but OSF, they fund so many good progressive causes. And no, that's just marketing. It's window dressing. Their stated goal from day one has always been regime change.
Well, absolutely.
And the white helmets in Syria was another. I mean, just because we keep drawing these parallels, they were a major funder of the white helmets PR operation known as the Syria campaign, and like all of the propaganda, the atrocity exhibition campaigns and the propaganda ops flowed through the Syria campaign, as we reported at the Gray Zone. So, and we're seeing it here again.
And when I point out to people that the opposition in Myanmar or here in Thailand or in Hong Kong, that they are being funded by these organizations, the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, people will they'll deny that that's true because they know that how bad it sounds. But then once you show them the evidence and they can't deny it, then they start to backpedal and they say, well, okay, but it's the National Endowment for Democracy. And it says right on the website that they're a private organization, that they're independent. And then you show that, no, they were created by the US government. They are funded and overseen by the US government. So no, they're not. They're just saying that doesn't mean it's true. And then they backpedal and they say, well, the US just wants to support democracy. What's wrong with that? And then you show them the board of directors of National Endowment for Democracy. And these are not people interested, demonstrably so, in anything to do with democracy or human rights or freedom. As a matter of fact, some of these people are involved in some of the worst crimes of the 21st century. And these are people who directly participated in the 2003 invasion of Iraq and its occupation. I think there's Scott Carpenter was part of the provisional government in Iraq. They murdered everyone in the Iraqi government or put them in prison, and they didn't have any time to set up a puppet regime, so they just had these white guys running around, running Iraq like viceroys from the British Empire. It was surreal. And he's sitting on the board of directors.
Alongside
and there's
Elliot
Abrams. Yeah, a war criminal.
Like a war criminal.
And Applebaum.
Yeah, exactly. And Anna Applebaum. I don't know how deeply you've gone into that, but she's on the Washington. She's at the Washington Post. She's at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I think she was part of the Dakota Story on the board or something.
She is.
Story.
I wrote an article about Coda Story. If anyone's interested, it's up at the Gray Zone, which is also funded by the NED and by European governments, and it plays the same role as one of these Western intelligence cutouts.
Exactly.
I wrote in my book, The Management of Savagery, about Anne Applebaum's husband. I think his name is Miroslav or something. I forget his last name right now. I'm actually amazed with myself that I remember his first name. He is a Polish journalist who went to Afghanistan, and he just got so overwhelmed with excitement that he put on a Mujahideen uniform, put down his camera, picked up an AK-47 with the Mujahideen in the 1980s, and actually helped them attack a Soviet military base, and fired. And then he said, I only hit the side of the building with a few bullets. I didn't shoot any soldiers. But that's who he is. And now he's a Polish diplomat in this kind of right-wing neoliberal regime that's been set up in Poland.
They call that extreme embedded reporting.
Yeah.
But by the way, other people on the board of directors of the NED, Victoria Nuland, one of the architects of the 2014 coup in Ukraine. I mean, it's just like, it's a motley crew of neocons and war criminals. Pretty incredible.
And their entire business is regime change. That's all they do. That's all of those people do. And when I point this out to people, that's when they just leave the conversation, because there is nothing else to say. You're taking money from war criminals, people who are at the NED specifically and solely for regime change. That's why it exists. There's no other reason. All of these platitudes about democracy and freedom and human rights, this is camouflage. It's a smokescreen that they do this all behind. And continuously repeat this because we're the only ones doing it. No one else is going to do it. And like well, I think Ben was saying before the show that a lot of these countries, their information game is very unsophisticated. And Max, you're when you go to Nicaragua and people see you, and they are, the reason why they are so happy is because they are so frustrated that no one is telling their side of the story. So that's why it's so important to continuously point these things out. A lot of people say, Brian, you talk about the NED too much. I'll stop talking about it when everyone knows what this is, and laws are put into place in all of these countries that stop this. The United States would never allow any other country to do this to them, and yet they're doing it to all of these countries around the world. So I'll stop talking about it when it stops.
Well, Bolivia kicked out the NED and also the DEA and USAID, and we saw what happened there with Evo Morales. I mean, a military coup. The U.S. will not tolerate it.
Yeah, I actually, when I interviewed the Nicaraguan president, Daniel Ortega, who's the famed revolutionary leader of the Sandinista party, I asked him specifically, why are you allowing the NED and its agents like Felix Maradiaga, who was filmed involved in violent activity in 2018 with guys waving pistols around, invading universities, who were attacking students and people in the neighborhood? Like, why do you allow them to operate openly? This isn't about democracy. I mean, you can see what's happening in your country. I've just been spending weeks with people who'd been tortured, had their eyes gouged out by these forces, killed, burned alive, police stations besieged. The whole country was set on fire. And I wouldn't say he was frightened, but and no one would notice this from the outside. Like I got attacked for that interview because I wasn't, subjecting him to an enhanced interrogation like every other journalist. Like, why don't you just go away and die in a hole? But I remember at the beginning of his interview with Maduro, Jorge, what's his name? From Univision, Jorge Ramos. Yeah, he's like, Ramos, well, are you a dictator? But
why are you a dictator? Is the first question.
it's that's what I was expected to do, but no one would have noticed this from the outside. But I think this was the toughest question that you could put to someone like Ortega, because it's such a sensitive question, because the consequences you face for kicking out the NED, I mean, you're basically wrapping up the entire U.S. project, which China just did in Hong Kong with the national security law. That's why everyone's freaking out about it in the West. When you do that, you face sanctions, you face an even harsher coup. The U.S. just will, and you're a country like Nicaragua that's small, that's so much weaker than China and Russia, that's in the Western Hemisphere and what the U.S. considers its backyard. That's a very sensitive issue. And I assume it's as sensitive for the Tatmadaw in Myanmar as well.
Yes. And here in Thailand, yes. I try to explain to people that it really isn't that easy. You have to be patient. I think the national security law support Hong Kong that sets a good precedent. And I think just people have to be patient and wait, because the U.S. is obviously it's a waning power, and these things that we're seeing, this is desperation. It's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. But we can see the trajectory that this is all taking, and it has to be a step-by-step process. But okay, if they don't want to kick them out, they need to up their information game. If they don't want to do it directly, like Russia and China do, they need to try to do it indirectly. And this is just something that I've been doing for 10 years because nobody else was doing it. It was very frustrating. And so this is what I'm talking about the NED. I'm exposing the NED, that it's behind these groups. Some of them put it on their website, but they kind of bury it. Some of them don't. And they'll beg for money too. On every time you click on any page on their website, they will beg for money. There's one called Prachatai here in Thailand, and they only posted it one time in 2011, and that was because I was kind of pressuring them for 6 months to do it, and they finally did it, and then they have never updated it. They have never put it on the Thai version of their website, so their Thai readers have no idea that they're funded by the U.S. government. Well, maybe now they know because it's becoming big news here, but they will beg for money, even though they're getting millions of baht, which is a lot of money here. It's not, it's not millions and millions of dollars, but millions of baht is a lot of money here in Thailand. And then they're still begging for money. It just goes to show you the sort of people that are part of these operations. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them as well. They're the same sort of people that get approached to do this and agree to do it.
Well, here's Myanmar Now's website. The first thing that happens when you open it, right at the bottom, it says, "The military regime is targeting Myanmar's journalists. Help us continue our vital reporting. Donate now." And this is an organization that gets how much money? I mean, tons of money from Western governments. So and their bank account is based in Australia, not in Myanmar. So it's just like help subsidize this Western government intelligence cutout. But it also reminds me of The Intercept, honestly. The Intercept is owned and was created by a billionaire, one of the richest people on earth, Pierre Omidyar, and they're constantly begging people for donations. And they're like, we're under attack.
They're not funded by the NED, but Bellingcat is, and they're also funded by open societies. I mean, it's a complete operation. And they also do the fundraising on their website, say, help support our independent grassroots journalism. It's open. It's just all open source. And we found out yesterday, I just saw someone on Twitter, 5 Filters do a analysis of our traffic versus theirs. And we're kicking their ass in traffic online. And that's not even counting our YouTube traffic. We have much more grassroots support. We don't have some billionaire government behind the curtain like they do, but when you see anyone mention them in Western media, and it's always positive, it's like the New Yorker has to come out with one puff piece on Elliot Higgins a year for some reason. It's like they're under contract, and they get all these flashy awards I've never heard of before. They're now nominated for the Orwell Award, which maybe is appropriate, kind of ironically, given Orwell's McCarthyite activity. And
his role as a British colonial officer in Burma.
Let's not. Oh, good point.
In Burma specifically.
But the point is, whenever they're mentioned, the NED connection is never mentioned. If we were like funded by the Kremlin or something, the gray zone was actually funded by the Kremlin, like they always say without evidence, then it would never be mentioned without that designation. I mean, it would be on our Twitter account and everything. But they're not listed as the U.S. government funded. I mean, none of these places are. They're considered absolutely independent, and they've now moved into the American sphere in a collaboration with MSNBC and Richard Engel, who is like another kind of CIA State Department mouthpiece, to do an investigation. They just had a special come out yesterday on January 6th, which I don't know how that comports with the rules around domestic propaganda. Obviously, it's all out the window, but the U.S. government's funding this organization, and they're going after Americans. Obviously, they're not like my favorite Americans that they're going after, but how is that? I don't know how that's legal. So the NED is now moving actually into the U.S. domestic space through these organizations. And I don't know if you have any response to that. I did want to talk about the China angle in Southeast Asia. But if you want to respond, go ahead.
I think that's a great point, and I think it's a double standard. But I never really expected any of these people to play fair. So of course they're going to cover it up and try to pretend that they're independent, and then they're going to smear everyone as a Russian agent or now a Chinese agent, and it's just to be expected, and we just have to figure out how to get around that, because they're going to continue doing it. But I think the reason why it's becoming so ridiculous is because, like you said, your traffic is beating them. I mean, who's going to sit and read Bellingcat? And honestly, the stuff that they write, and then the way that Elliot Higgins conducts himself publicly on social media, who really takes him seriously? Do people take him seriously? I don't know.
We know the CIA take them seriously because Foreign Policy published a piece and they quoted numerous CIA operatives, including senior level figures, who said this is an exact quote: "We love Bellingcat," and they said the Bellingcat is so useful to us.
But that, Brian,
I bet.
You make a great point, Brian, and I think it highlights what the utility of Bellingcat is. It's just, I mean, I don't even think Elliot Higgins is taken seriously by any of these people. He's just like a convenient front because he plays the part of this nerdy house husband who's this shut-in, and he looks like some scrappy independent journalist and seems that way. And then you've got all of these spooks. There's a great piece by Alan McLeod in Mint Press now. All of these semi-retired or active, or I don't know what they are, people who come through the national security state pipeline into Bellingcat, and they're not doing open source journalism. Everything's getting passed to them. I mean, as Aaron Mate, our colleague, began shredding their narrative around the Duma deception and how these OPCW whistleblowers had their careers destroyed and were facing all these threats for telling the truth about what happened in Duma, Bellingcat was just getting fed dodgy documents, which turned out to be bogus, from OPCW management. Or after the Skripal poisoning, this mysterious incident in Salisbury, well, Bellingcat just somehow got past the passport info of the two Russian suspects. How did they get that? It wasn't open source. They got it through UK intelligence. And now we've reported at the Gray Zone through these leaks that were online that Bellingcat was actually being sent to train in North Macedonia journalists who were on the pro-NATO side on the eve of an election to basically meddle in an election. I mean, I'm surprised they're not in Southeast Asia, but you have all these other groups. So it's obviously just a straight up operation, and they're kind of just, they're fronting for it. They're not going out and doing shoe leather journalism. And I don't know what Higgins' specific skill set really is, because he doesn't seem to be very talented. And on Twitter,
Max, he's good at playing video games. Remember?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed he was like presiding over all these online chat forums for years, and he was just kind of like this, and he was looking at photos in Syria and often getting it wrong as Brown Moses. But, you know, the real story is how people can just be instrumentalized by much smarter people behind them. I think that's what we're seeing here. Much more devious people. And then, you know, they get rewarded and built up into this giant thing. It's just, and then the ideological discipline of media is so amazing to me. How they manage to just stay on script about such an obvious shambolic operation, an information war operation, and no journalist in the mainstream breaks from the script. It's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I want to point out really quickly, our colleague Aaron Mate discovered this in a New York Times puff piece on Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. This is so amazing. It's called "These Reporters Rely on Public Data Rather Than Secret Sources." Although, as Max just pointed out, that's a lie. It's not true. But it's so awesome. It says, "The blogger Elliot Higgins made waves early in the decade by covering the war in Syria from a laptop in his apartment in England while caring for his infant daughter. He founded Bellingcat, etc." Higgins attributed his skill not to any special knowledge of international conflicts or digital data, but to the hours he had spent playing video games, which he said gave him the idea that any mystery can be cracked. I mean, imagine the New York Times covering another media
Makes
outlet
sense.
if their founder had said, "Yeah, I don't have any expertise, but I'm good at video games." But they of course spin it in the way that makes it sound like a dramatic, Mission Impossible movie or something.
Well, let's get back to the lecture at hand. The little rabbit hole there, but I'm sure everyone found it enlightening and entertaining. But Brian, I mean, you alluded in the beginning of this discussion to the Pentagon Papers, and I actually hadn't considered this specifically about what the point of the U.S. intervention in Vietnam was. And, I doubt many people from the anti-Vietnam War movement even picked up on this at the time, but it's so explosive. And it's that the analysis that the Defense Department had performed also mentioned the importance of having U.S. troops in the region to contain China and to prevent China from emerging as this threat to U.S. control. So are we now at the kind of culmination of that strategy or a continuation of that strategy? And can you describe what why you referred back to the Pentagon Papers?
The Pentagon Papers specifically say that there was no point to bomb northern Vietnam and to continue the war unless it was to contribute towards the overarching U.S. policy of containing China. And then they identified the different areas that they were going to focus on to contain China. And of course, the troops in South Korea and Japan, Southeast Asia, and then also Pakistan and India. And we can see how the US has been playing games in each and every one of these areas toward that end. They constantly provoke problems with North Korea as an excuse to keep troops in South Korea. It has nothing to do with North Korea. It has to do with keeping troops right there near China. And the same goes for Japan. Like I said, these attempted color revolutions here in Southeast Asia, the building up of these networks with the National Endowment for Democracy, this is their game that they're playing in Southeast Asia. And of course, India as part of the Quad with Australia and Japan led by the US. And they've been trying to destabilize and create all kinds of problems in Pakistan for as long as I've been paying attention to it. So this is what they've been doing all along China's peripheries. And in Myanmar, the whole point of this is to disrupt all of those infrastructure projects. The whole point of the protests here in Thailand is to get these, not just get the government out of power, but to disfigure the country's institutions. People don't maybe or maybe not know this, but Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia that was never colonized by a Western power. And Thai people attribute that to their monarchy, which is like 700 years, has been around for 700 years. It's a very unifying force in Thailand. Here in Thailand, you have Muslims and Buddhists and all of these groups working together because it was never divided and destroyed by empire. And so the US wants to disfigure that. You will see the keystone of their propaganda war against Thailand is attacking the military and the monarchy. And then they have the riots in Hong Kong. They are busy in Vietnam. They tried hard in Laos. There's just no traction there at all. And Cambodia, interestingly enough, has actually kicked the NED, Voice of America, all of them out. They even supposedly knocked over some building the US Navy built for them so that China could build their own building in its place at some port. So that was a very interesting story. I don't know whatever happened with that. I gotta check on that. But that's what's going on here in Southeast Asia. So yes, it's still this policy. It's obvious now. I mean, the U.S. government openly says China is the enemy, and this game in Southeast Asia is part of that. It's part of this containment policy. It's not just the Uyghur situation and their propaganda war there. They had been working on Tibet since at least the 50s with armed rebellion, and Taiwan. Obviously, this is a huge issue that the U.S. is invested in. So we're going to continue seeing this.
Yeah, and Brian, there's one elephant in the room that I wish I had mentioned earlier. I feel a little remiss not mentioning it in terms of the U.S. trying to contain China, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative. Myanmar and Thailand are both part of Belt and Road, and we've seen in these protests in Myanmar that there has been targeting of Chinese-owned businesses. Dozens of Chinese-owned businesses have been attacked and even burnt down, including Chinese employees have been attacked. And we saw that actually the government of Taiwan and the government of South Korea told businesses that are in Myanmar to wave the national flags of their countries outside, so the insurgents know not to attack them and to instead attack the other businesses. And we also saw Reuters reported, which is absolutely incredible. Reuters reported that there were protesters chanting, "We're going to burn down the Chinese pipeline," which is clearly a very organic protest that you hear all the time if you go to a protest in Myanmar. You know, that people just spontaneously start chanting, "Let's burn down Chinese pipelines." No, I mean, it's extremely suspicious. But what we haven't talked about is the role of Belt and Road in all of this. We know that Myanmar plays a very important role in this ambitious global infrastructure program led by Beijing that not only involves the creation of railroads and ports, but also would really move the center of the global economy back to Asia and back really to Eurasia as a landmass, away from the kind of Atlantic trade that goes on across the Atlantic between the United States, Canada, Western Europe. So what is the role of Belt and Road in all of this, not only in terms of the destabilization efforts targeting Myanmar, but also Thailand?
It's exactly that. I mean, the U.S. is adamant about how it's going to compete with this project, which they have nothing to actually really compete with. So what they're going to do is just spoil it. And that's what they're doing in Myanmar. That's what they're trying to do here in Thailand. I just was looking at this WikiLeaks. This was one of the cables. It's titled "Burma, Grassroots Opposition to Chinese-Backed Dam in Northern Burma." And this is from 2010. And then they say, an unusual aspect of this case is the role grassroots organizations have played in opposing the dam, which speaks to the growing strength of civil society groups in Kachin State, including recipients of embassy small grants. So there was nothing grassroots about it. They were funded by the U.S. Embassy to block the joint Myanmar-Chinese dam. They went out and they did that. And these Kachin groups also have armed rebels. So they would go out and attack the construction site also. And they've done this for over the years. They've been doing this. And if you check through the news, you will even see the Western media reporting on all of this. So that was their strategy. They use human rights and environmental concerns. But what this is about is just disrupting Chinese-driven development of the region.
It's amazing you actually see the Guardian reporting on that 9 years ago. It would never do, or 10 years ago, it would never do that today. It would never give up the game the way it did. The Guardian headline is WikiLeaks cables, Americans funded groups that stalled Burma Dam project. So it's all right there. And you see the same people from the National League of Democracy, the Aung San Suu Kyi opposition in the photo protesting the dam. And so that really does validate what you're saying, that this is ultimately about disrupting and destabilizing Belt and Road. I guess I'm wondering how critical is Myanmar to the Belt and Road Initiative and to just the wider project of, these Chinese trade deals and infrastructure projects?
They have a port in Rakhine State, and this is to receive oil from the Middle East and then cut the transit time. So the pipeline brings it to Kunming in southern China. So they don't have to go all the way around to Chinese ports. They can just drop it off in Myanmar. And so if they could disrupt this pipeline, when they say attack the pipeline, they know how important this is to China. And that's why they're doing it. That's why the U.S. dumps millions of dollars into these ethnic groups to encourage them to do this, to block construction, and then once it's constructed, to constantly threaten it and create headaches for China. I don't think that there's any chance of Myanmar becoming some sort of constructive ally of the US, but I do see them transforming it into a dysfunctional, failed state and just having it like a dead weight hanging from Beijing's neck for the next decade.
Right. I mean, so where do you think things are headed? Do you think there will be an accommodation with the opposition to tamp down on what appears to be an armed conflict right now?
It's hard to say in that aspect. What is pretty clear is that they have the parallel government. They have the federal army, because I guess if they said Free Burma Army, it would be too obvious what they were doing.
Yeah.
So they have that. And then we already see the U.S. ambassador to the UN trying to posture to get the UN Security Council to act. And what I think they will do is recognize that parallel government, like they did Juan Guaido, and then they will try to get their allies to recognize it, and then they will start flooding the country with weapons and just. I don't know if there will be some sort of intervention. It's hard to believe or to imagine the U.S. sending its military to Southeast Asia. That's really hard to imagine, and in a country that is right on China's border, it's hard to imagine that. But I could see them doing everything up to that, openly arming the opposition.
The U.S. always has, with Venezuela right now, there is extreme tension on the border between Colombia and Venezuela in Apure state. And we can talk about what's going on there, but it's really a symptom of Colombia's role as the Israel of South America. And then you have the Israel of the Middle East, which is Israel, and the role it plays there as a destabilizing force. It can be a U.S. aircraft carrier, as Alexander Haig called it. It's been attacking Iranian shipping. Which country in Southeast Asia can play that role? Where would the weapons flow in from?
I think they already have established networks through those ethnic rebel groups. How exactly they're getting the weapons in is hard to tell. I think they do it through the fake NGOs. The border, the frontier area between China and Myanmar is a very remote area. So there's all kinds of things that could be going on there that maybe even the Chinese government doesn't have full control over. And then there's India. They share a border with India. And if India thought that they could somehow get an advantage over China or please the U.S., maybe this is kind of the reason behind this. The U.S. just did a freedom of navigation exercise off of India's coast, humiliated India, one of the Quad Alliance members. Right. Maybe that was to take them down a notch and say, you are going to do this for us. You've got the border with Myanmar. You're going to do this for us.
And threaten to sanction India at the same time.
Yes, and because India is, I think, a reluctant member of the Quad Alliance. They have relationships with Russia that go way back that they don't want to give up. And they would be foolish if they did give it up. And so there's all kinds of games being played. And we're just going to have to wait and see. But the main thing, my main objective at this point is to get the word out that this isn't just some, how many times does the U.S. have to do this to use the exact same story and demolish an entire country and then destabilize an entire region before people sense something suspicious is going on when they see the same song and dance?
That's something I just wanted to get out there. Why we wanted to host you is because you're one of the few people sounding the alarm, and we will be accused of supporting a brutal military junta that comes with the territory. But the issue here isn't whether we support the Tatmadaw and we're, cheering for these generals. That has nothing to do with why we're hosting you, having this discussion, or trying to get the word out. It's because there is a project to destabilize a society. Civil wars are horrible, particularly in developing nations. And this country is being meddled with from the outside. I think there are so many members of the Syrian opposition now who deeply regret what took place in that country. and the militarization and radicalization of the opposition. It's left the whole country in complete oblivion, and the same with Libya. So that's what I think our fear is here. And you know, any concern for the military junta, to me, is sort of, or Aung San Suu Kyi, is irrelevant. I mean, and also you have this lionization of the opposition, but no one actually knows what their agenda is, who they are, or what their ideology is. And so it's important to get it out. And the American public particularly is never given the facts to be able to make up their minds about what their government is doing, often covertly, with their tax dollars. So that's why I think it's important to have you on and have this discussion.
Yes, and I mean, when you go through the Twitter feed of some of these Western journalists, or even the journalists here in the region, but who lean west, and you were talking about the discipline within the media. Yeah. I don't think that it's so much self-discipline. I think it's just the fear of falling out of favor, because I know a lot of journalists here in Southeast Asia, local people who are in journalism, they fear the Foreign Correspondents Club with the BBC and AP, AFP, Reuters, all of them coming down on them, calling them conspiracy theorists, or accusing them of supporting a brutal dictatorship, or being anti-democracy. These are all things that I've been accused of. This is something they all cited when they kicked me off of social media. Of course, I'm looking at what's actually happening, and I'm pointing out that this game has already been played. It has erased countries off the map, and it's being done right now next door to Thailand. Those people in Myanmar, it doesn't matter what they think they're fighting for. It only matters what's really happening. And what's really happening is they're being used, and they're going to be used to divide and destroy their country. And unfortunately for Myanmar, this is a lesson that they haven't learned from their own history. And so we're watching this slide back into, I call it recolonization, because they were already colonized once, and they're doing the exact same thing. They're dividing them, and they're going to destroy them. And people say the military in Myanmar is so brutal. They've been fighting for decades, since they gained independence, against armed groups funded and armed by the West, by their former colonial masters, to ensure that nothing resembling a stable, prosperous country emerges. So what kind of environment, that's the environment. What kind of government do you think is going to come out of that environment?
Right.
Jeffersonian democracy? How would that even be possible? It's not practical.
It reminds me so much of Syria, right? And in Western Asia, these countries that are still, there's a process to try to recolonize them. The U.S. is currently militarily occupying 1/3 of Syrian territory, including its oil and wheat rich regions. So, I mean, what do people expect? Like some perfect, benevolent social democracy? I mean, it's so childish. And it reminds me also of the infantile critiques of the former Soviet Union, of Cuba, of Venezuela to an extent, where they say these countries are authoritarian, ignoring the 600 assassination attempts against Fidel Castro, ignoring the constant proxy wars and invasions and coup attempts. I mean, it's so childish. But, you know, we're already almost at an hour and a half, so I think we're going to wrap up soon. But I had a few final questions. One, I just wanted to point out really quickly, because Max had a really good question about how, if you think back, for instance, to the wars in Central America in the 1980s, the U.S. used the right-wing regime in Honduras and also El Salvador as bases to launch the war on the revolutionary government in Nicaragua. And the question is, like, what could it look like, this insurgency movement in Southeast Asia? And at the Gray Zone, we just published a really interesting piece by our friend Gareth Porter, a brilliant reporter. And this article looks at the Pentagon's attempt to lobby Vietnam to allow the U.S. to build a U.S. military base there for a potential war, or rather counterinsurgency, or rather insurgency operations against China from inside Vietnam. And his article points out how this was, dead on arrival, that Vietnam has a strong, decades-long commitment to equidistance between Washington and Beijing, and it didn't go anywhere. But it shows that Washington is trying in Southeast Asia. It's going to these different countries, meeting with them, trying to twist their arms into allowing them to build a U.S. military base. But the question I had for you while we wrap up, Brian, is that one of the more kind of sophisticated talking points we've seen from people who will say, okay, fine, maybe the U.S. is supporting, I mean, because it's an objective fact, maybe the NED has been funding Aung San Suu Kyi and her other allies and the opposition forces in Myanmar. Okay, but what they'll say is that, but look, Aung San Suu Kyi, she actually signed agreements with China. She supported the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, so what their argument is that, well, actually, she also was an ally of China, as if she somehow was also a cat's paw, and everyone is controlled by China. And of course, that's a kind of infantile view, because the reality, as you said earlier, is that Myanmar, by virtue of being a neighbor of China, is always going to have economic relations with this massive economic power that's right next to it. But I'm curious as what you would say to that response from people who say that, well, if you say that what the U.S. is trying to do is destabilize a country that is an important potential Chinese ally that is part of the Belt and Road, then why is Aung San Suu Kyi also working with the Chinese?
I think that her signing deals with China, again, this was all pragmatic. Everyone is doing business with China. Even the U.S. is still doing business with China. It's unavoidable. It's going to be the largest economy on earth. It has the largest population on earth. It has a massive industrial base. So, and Myanmar is on the border with China. So if Aung San Suu Kyi just, as soon as she got into power, just cut all ties with China, that would be the end of the country. Everything would collapse. People would have no food. They would have no energy. They would have nothing. They would have a wrecked country. And so she has to do the minimum. But like I said, her whole network is anti-Chinese. The whole point was she was between a rock and a hard place. But if the U.S. had a pick between the military and Aung San Suu Kyi and her whole support base that was created and to this day still funded and directed out of Washington, who are they going to pick? They're obviously going to pick Aung San Suu Kyi. And as we can see, they really don't have any concern about leaving a country for her to rule over. The way they're maneuvering all of the pieces on the board is, again, a Libya or Syria style conflagration. So does that really seem like they were serious about building up Aung San Suu Kyi and having her the head of a functioning, prosperous nation? I think the answer is no. Again, the U.S. has no friends. Aung San Suu Kyi, I don't think the military could accept her being in power. Again, we have to remember the NED's penetration of Myanmar. Any election that was held, that her party is backed by this gargantuan machine, this political machine that extends outside of Myanmar's borders all the way back to Washington. There was no way for the military to ever compete there was no such thing as a fair and free election in Myanmar, because democracy is supposed to be a process of self-determination. Everything about the National League for Democracy is determined in Washington and by people who were educated by the West or even in the West. And so how are you supposed to have a fair and free election? So this is why the military took over. Aung San Suu Kyi, maybe she was signing deals with China. How serious was any of that? That dam that they canceled years ago, was that going to start up again? I don't think so. So we didn't see that much progress under Aung San Suu Kyi. She paid lip service to China. She was signing some deals maybe, but I don't see anything concrete that said, yes, she was definitely a puppet of China. Her entire political, why is the NED still funding her entire network if she's a puppet of China? It makes no sense. And where is the motivation of this network to serve China? Because it's the military and their networks that have the actual economic interests inside the country, not her and her party. Their source of financing and power comes from outside of Myanmar. Just follow the money.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the kind of purists who criticize Venezuela because Venezuela used to sell oil to the United States, as if this country, this massive gargantuan that is right north of the border, they're not going to do business with the United States, the second largest economic power in the world, as if like an elected president can come in it wasn't like Cuba. There wasn't a revolution. It was Chavismo won through elections, and is that they're just going to come in and like force a blockade on themselves. I mean, it's just the people who make these critiques are so often infantile, and they have like this like purity politics where everything is about, you know, you just have to show how pure you are, and you can't be tainted by the real world. I mean, it's absurd, but thank you, Brian. I mean, I think you really spelled it out in a way that not only I think is accurate, but I think is actually very simple. Like, I think anyone who watched this or listened to this, hopefully if they didn't know anything about Myanmar, hopefully they can now understand what's actually happening, because there's another issue with obfuscation. Like, you can read how many dozens or hundreds of media reports, and still you'll get all these details, you get overwhelmed by information, but nothing actually explains what is simply going on the ground. And that's why I'm also grateful for the work that you do, because it's accurate and it's full of details, but it also it's straightforward.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing me on and giving me this opportunity to share this information more widely, because that's something that I've been struggling with for like 10 years now, just trying to get this out to as many people as possible. And it's really, it makes me feel great when I see organizations like the Gray Zone who are doing it so much better and reaching so many more people. And when I started 10 years ago, I felt like it was a straight up climb. And now it's just it's so great to see other people doing it and spreading this information out. So I'm very, very thankful for the work that you do at the Gray Zone. And I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for taking time to join us. I know it's late over there, but you know, everyone who watched this and enjoyed it, check out Land Destroyer. That's Brian's channel on YouTube. He has regular videos that explain what's happening, not just in Myanmar, but in relation to U.S.-China policy, what's happening in Thailand, where he lives, and beyond. I mean, and you know, Brian's had informative pieces recently about Uganda and the destabilization of Iran. So yeah, definitely check out his work. And Ben, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add in closing, or to just take us out of here.
Yeah, well, I also wanted to plug, of course, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/moderaterebels, but also Brian has a Patreon here. It's patreon.com/landdestroyer. So definitely check out that. You can support his work there, and definitely go to his YouTube channel, because he has really excellent videos explaining all of this, and no one else is doing this work. So Brian, thanks for joining us. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.